We are in Brussels, the capital of the European Union, in the Royal Park, the Parc Royal, just between the Royal Castle and the Belgian Federal Parliament. And just behind us, there were the two flags, is the Veranda, the club of the leading business people from Flanders. We will have now an interview with Erik Solheim. Welcome, Erik Solheim, here in the Veranda, in the office of Europe-Asia Center. I'm Frank Schwalber-Roth, German, one of the founders of the German Green Party and last century the first Green in the European Parliament. Most people here in Brussels who work on environment, who work on development policy and who work on Asia know you because you have been minister in your country, in Norway, Minister for Development, North-South Development, Minister for Environment. And then you were with the United Nations as Under-Secretary General of the United Nations and Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Program. And because of your activities now to work on Europe-Asian issues, especially China and India, you are quite often in Brussels and you participate in the debate intensively what should be the future relationship between Europe, European Union and China. Therefore, I have prepared 6 questions which I would like now to ask to you. In which direction is the EU-China relation going to develop? How to define it based on your large political experience?
Look, the relationship between China and the West is the defining relationship of our time. If we get that right, we'll be able to basically solve all major problems on the planet. If it gets sour and wrong, we will be deep in the shit. We want to get out of the COVID economically in a strong way everywhere in the world, providing jobs to people. We want to handle climate change and the environment. We want to find means to handle future pandemics. We want peace in Ukraine and global peace and solve regional conflicts. Whatever is the need, will be much easier to achieve if we get the relationship between the West and China right. The way to do that is to focus on what unites us. An economy, ecology, peace, all these are issues where we can find common ground. Let's focus on all the areas where we can do something together, the West and China. And then for sure there will be areas of disagreement. We will not agree on the political system. I mean, America will not adopt the Chinese political system, nor will Europe, but nor will the Chinese adopt our political system. So we need to work together. And if there are disagreements on Ukraine or Taiwan or human rights or whatever issue, it must be a dialogue based on respect, where again we try to find common ground, because then they're so much stronger.
Chinese companies have chosen to invest in Europe, especially in the Central and Eastern European countries, the CEE countries, especially in Hungary. Will and should CEE become a new landmark for Chinese companies to go overseas to Europe?
Well, the big picture is, of course, that we should welcome a lot more Chinese investments in Europe and a lot more European investments in China, because if trade is a major factor for economic development, but also to get the environment right. Because if the economy is efficient, we waste less resources, and that's good for the environment. So let's welcome stronger economic ties in a broad scale. But of course, the Eastern European nations have some benefits from a Chinese point of view. Salaries tend to be lower than in Western Europe, while knowledge and education standards are now high. So there are reasons why Chinese companies may want to invest in Eastern Europe, and that's good. But let's also welcome them to Western Europe. And let's be aware that when it comes to every single green technology in the world, China is now the world leader. 82% of all solar panels in the world last year were made in China. 70% of all electric batteries last year were made in China. And whether it's hydropower, green hydrogen, solar, wind, electric cars, whatever is the issue, China is the number one. So we in Europe simply need to get up very early in the morning if we want to compete with China in the green sectors.
Chinese business, Chinese politics know quite well 16+1, which is 16. Some Central and Eastern European countries from within the European Union and from the Western Balkan, from former Yugoslavia. And one is China. How do you evaluate the 16+1 cooperation?
I think what we really should aim at is 27+1, so the entire EU working with China, because there is so much we can achieve together. So let's focus on the areas of joint achievements. Then the world will be a much better place.
COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. What EU-China perspectives do you see for closer cooperation in all these efforts against climate change?
The most important is, of course, environment technologies, because we cannot find a way out of the deep climate crisis if we are not very fast moving into solar energy, wind energy, electric mobility, a circular economy, and all these demands improved technology. So, and that's why private investment in both directions is so important, because that's the way of exchanging technologies and improving on that. But added, we should also discuss best environment practice. And again, we in Europe should not fool ourselves. Yes, 20 years ago, for sure, we were well ahead of China when it came to environment practices. But now I think China is probably ahead of us. They have cleaned up the rivers and the air at a speed much higher than we have done in Europe. Yes, we have cleaned up the Rhine in Europe, but China is doing the same, just at a much higher speed. Air quality in Europe is largely good. China has improved that in just one decade. 10 years ago, Chinese cities were heavily polluted. Now you can see the sky, you can breathe the air of Beijing or Shanghai. It's very, very different. And China is embarking upon some major environment programs under the umbrella Beautiful China, protecting the giant panda, which in the past was a very endangered species. Fishing ban in the Great Yangtze and also the upper Yellow River is enormous river systems. Fishing ban is of course painful in the short term, but in the long term it's very, very beneficial, and the fishes will come back and the ecosystem will come back in a major way, and there will be fish in abundance. So exchange of best practice, best ideas, best policies, while jointly improving the technology. That's the way forward in the European Chinese partnerships for the environment.
In which other areas, besides climate, do you think that China and Europe can have an in-depth cooperation in the future? Possibly even reconstruction in Ukraine.
There is a need to try to find common ground for all the global conflicts. I mean, look at when we had the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. Wherever there was a conflict, everywhere, say in Africa, one side supported one group, the other supported the other. I mean, some supported people from north, the United States would support the people from the north of the nation, and then the Russians would support the people from the south. Just different tribes, different ethnicities, and every war outside Europe became very, very violent because of this Cold War perspective. It's not like that at the moment, because in most major conflicts, China and Europe and the United States has the common interest of stability, because that's much better for the global economy and it puts people much less in danger. So say in Ukraine, the Chinese has now come very, very powerfully forward, saying that it's crazy threatening with nuclear weapons in Ukraine. That's a strong message to the Russians and to Mr. Putin. And while the Chinese, like the Indians or Brazilians or Africans, will not boycott Russia, still there is common ground in the fight for the sovereignty of Ukraine. We need to restore Ukraine as a sovereign nation, and then we can find common ground. And of course, when there is a peace deal in Ukraine, there will be a massive need to restore Ukraine. The losses have been dramatic. That will be a very difficult time, because the Ukrainian state system is not perfect, to put it that way. Ukraine lost 300,000 citizens every year for the last 30 years before the war. So it was a nation in problems before the war. And of course this has been extremely exacerbated by the war, and then the reconstruction will be difficult, and China has a lot of resources to provide for that, as well as Europe. So let's look into how it can be done together.
How do you evaluate the visit of the German Chancellor to China? And for China's new leadership, what suggestions and expectations do you have for promoting, if possible, win-win, a cooperation between the two sides, the EU on one side and China on the other?
Chancellor Scholz should get a lot of credit for this brave step to go to Beijing. I mean, he was facing a number of criticism from different circles. It was exactly the right thing to do, because we need to work together on environment, on Ukraine, on whatever is the crisis in the world. Only if the EU and China work together, we can resolve them. And then, of course, visits like Mr. Scholz's visit was a very hopeful moment. And it also helped investment for different big German companies in China, which is good. We need more of that. China needs access to European technology, but we also need access to their technologies. And of course, the very good news was that the next step after Prime Minister Scholz's visit was the top meeting between by President Xi and President Biden in Bali, which was also a huge positive step forward. Didn't resolve all problems. For sure, there will be many difficulties in the future, but it put the Western-Chinese relationship on a more solid footing, which we should all appreciate.
Thank you, Erik Solheim, for your intensive answers. You are Norwegian. You are so often here in the European Union, and you will be so often in the European Union in the future, because you are working on EU-Asia issues, that most people here consider you as a quasi-European, EU-European. And as you have been so active in environment, in North-South issues, everyone here active in environment and North-South issues knows you. And if they haven't met you personally, they would like to do it in the future. And now the readers of Financial Times Chinese version have the pleasure and the possibility to be confronted with your ideas. Thank you, Erik Solheim.
A pleasure, thank you so much.